Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Marquette Law School for our program on prosecutors and politics. My name is Professor Michael O'Hare, and I will be moderating the program today. We have a really terrific group of panelists lined up for you. We'll be hearing first from Professor Carissa Byrne-Hessek of the University of North Carolina School of Law. She is a leading academic expert on the subject of prosecutors and politics. And as many of you are probably aware, she will also be serving as our Barak lecturer later today. Carissa is joined by three leading prosecutors from different parts of Wisconsin. So our panel will include John Chisholm, who currently serves as the district attorney in Milwaukee County and has been in that role since 2007. Christian Gossett is with us from Winnebago County. He served as the district attorney of Winnebago County from 2007 until earlier this year, and is currently the deputy DA. And finally, Teresa Whetstone has served as the Marathon County District Attorney since 2017. We're honored to have all of these distinguished panelists with us today. So here's our agenda. Carissa will lead off with about 15 to 20 minutes of presentation on some of her research. After that, each of our DA panelists will take about 5 to 10 minutes to respond and share any additional thoughts they have. And then we'll have a little bit of conversation and, time permitting, perhaps some audience questions at the end. So, with no further ado, I'll turn the podium over to Carissa.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to all of you for joining us here today for lunch. I'm very excited to be here. I was already asking all sorts of questions of our other panelists in the back before we came in here because, as Michael alluded to, I study prosecutors. And so the chance to hear from some real live prosecutors is kind of like a nerdy dream of mine. So thank you all for being here to witness it. I want to start today by talking about some facts. 45 states in America elect their local prosecutors. Most of them do that on a 4-year cycle, although one state has prosecutors serve only 2-year terms, and one has them serve 8-year terms, and there are a couple of 6-year terms thrown in there as well. Most states have these elections with political parties, so they're partisan elections. Only 5 states have nonpartisan elections. The majority of these prosecutors' offices are county offices, though 16 states group counties into larger districts. And there are a total of more than 2,300 elected district attorneys in the country. More than half of the offices, these district attorneys' offices, are in jurisdictions with fewer than 100,000 people, and only 43 offices are in jurisdictions with more than 1 million. Now, most Americans don't know any of the facts that I just told you. And frankly, it was really difficult for me to learn these facts. I can't tell you how hard it was to make sure that we counted all of the district attorney or local prosecutor offices, because sometimes, like Texas, they just shift their district lines or carve out a new district. It's hard. But what's wrong with that is the office of district attorney is actually a really, really, really important office. And so at the University of North Carolina, we started something called the Prosecutors and Politics Project to try to find more out about local prosecutors and to share that information with the rest of the country. So for example, a majority of Americans don't even know that local prosecutors are an elected office. They just assume that they're appointed or civil servants. Most academics in law schools and in other departments don't have enough data to try to study this office. And then the public discussion about crime and elections tend to, when they talk about prosecutors at all, focus on large cities, mostly on the 2 coasts, and not talk about the vast majority of offices, which are much smaller than that. So what do? We try to look at questions about prosecutors on a national level. When possible, we try to look at every single office in the country. And then we provide information about how different states either conform to the national trend or differ from it. And then we publish our findings in reports, academic articles, and if we find something that we think is important enough and could be sort of fixed or changed, we even write op-eds sometimes. So today what I'm hoping to do is to tell you guys a little bit about the research that we've been doing on prosecutors and talk to you about some of those national trends, and then more specifically what we found here in Wisconsin. So the first type of research I want to talk to you about is about prosecutor elections. When we decided to undertake this project in 2018, there was very little information available about prosecutor elections. There's a professor down the road from us in North Carolina at Wake Forest, a man named Ronald Wright. He'd looked at prosecutor elections in 15 states, and he'd only looked at elections involving incumbents, right? So the person who was already in office. And he looked at election returns, and he found that incumbents won 95% of the time when they ran for re-election, and that a lot of them ran unopposed. So what we did was we looked at all of the prosecutor elections in all of the states, and I think interestingly, we confirmed Wright's finding. In our study as well, even though it was almost a decade after Wright's study, we also found that 95% of incumbents won re-election. But we found that it wasn't just incumbents who weren't drawing challengers, even when there was an open seat election. So even when the prosecutor decided not to run for re-election, oftentimes those open seat elections were uncontested. In fact, we found what I thought was a pretty staggering number, which was that nationwide, only 30% of the prosecutors in office had faced an opponent in either their primary or their general election. So that meant 70% of them never faced an opponent on the ballot at all. We found, as you can tell from this chart, that what seemed to matter was whether an incumbent run. If it was an open seat, you were more likely to see a challenger. But population also really mattered, right? The larger the district, the more likely you were to have more than one person running. You might ask yourself, what's wrong with uncontested elections? Well, if you think democracy is how we're supposed to pick our prosecutors, then you might think it's a good idea to give voters more than one choice. But I think that there are also other reasons to think that contested elections are a good thing. We've been doing some research on media coverage, for example, and we found that oftentimes when there's not a contested election, the media doesn't even mention the prosecutor in any stories. Or if they do mention them, they get a lot less coverage than when they're in a contested election. Okay, so what happened in Wisconsin? Wisconsin is dead on with the national trend. 30% nationwide of prosecutors faced an opponent. Wisconsin is exactly at 30%. Now, you might ask yourself, is this trend stable? Our data that we used in our big report sort of went as far back as 2012 up through 2017. So like our Wisconsin data is from 2016. We've finished gathering all of the election data from 2018 and 2019, and we found that the national rate didn't really change. I think it's 29% instead of 30%. But we did see a big difference in our big jurisdictions. The jurisdictions with over 1 million people, we saw a lot more contested elections, more so than we found in our previous cycle, and then we found, like in a bunch of other places, the open seat elections. Anyways, that's why it still comes out to roughly the same number. Wisconsin didn't have an election in 2018 or 2019. Wisconsin had an election in 2020. We haven't finished our data collection from that yet, so I can't tell you whether Wisconsin is going to continue to follow the national trend. I will say, if you might be wondering what's potentially different about these big city elections, that we see more contested elections, and I have a theory. And it's a theory that's tied not only to the fact that there are more contested elections in the big cities, but also that the rate of contested elections has gone up in those cities. And my theory is that some of these elections have become nationalized. That is to say that even if you aren't living in a particular place, you might hear something about an election that's happening there. So like, for example, did anyone hear about the recall election in San Francisco for their, yeah, I mean, we don't live in San Francisco. and yet we heard about that election. That election got nationalized. And my theory is that this nationalization of elections leads to more people wanting to enter the races, especially people who want to challenge the status quo. They're sometimes referred to as progressive prosecutors or reform prosecutors. And I'll say, I think there's more support for my theory in the next study that we did, and that's a study of campaign contributions. So let me just say really quickly, this data, when we did our election study, we at the same time tried to get all of the campaign finance information from all of these races. It took a very long time to get that information. And we basically found that there's enormous variation across the country. It matters if your election is contested or uncontested. The average contested election raised about $29,000. The average uncontested election raised $0. I raise money if you're uncontested. And as you can see from the chart behind me, the population size really matters in terms of how much money people were raising. What about here in Wisconsin? Well, Wisconsin sort of roughly follows, well, I was going to say, unlike the election data, where Wisconsin seemed right on national trend, there's something really weird about what we found in Wisconsin. I don't know if you can see it there, but the highest grossing candidate was from Jefferson County, and according to Google, Jefferson County does not have a lot of people in it. It has fewer than 100,000 people in it, which puts it in our lowest population category. And this person ran unopposed. If anyone has any theories on this, okay.
She ran for Attorney General.
Oh.
She wasn't a DA candidate.
Yeah. Fun times.
2014, in the 2 years previous to that, she ran for AG, so that would have been monies that would have still been listed on her CFR.
It wouldn't have been listed on our CFR. Oh, would it have? We should only have them. I'm going to have to go back and double check that. Well, that would make a lot of sense. We'll have to go back and double check that. Usually folks have to file different reports when they run for different offices. I'll have to go back and check the date on this. Another possibility could be that if she ran for AG, she just has a lot of people who are devoted to giving her money at this point, because a lot of folks who run otherwise, like, why give them money? But thank you for that. Yeah, what we would expect to see is the number 2 candidate, Mr. Chisholm, who we'll hear from in a few minutes, large population county, faced a challenger in his primary. So that's on point with the national trend. Okay. So you might wonder why we would care about this sort of information. Like, why should we care about why prosecutor candidates are raising money? Well, I'll say, just like in all elections, statistically, the people who raise more money tend to win at a higher rate than the people who raise less money. So nationally, winning candidates outraised their opponents. The fundraising advantage of winners got significantly bigger in the large population districts, and the challengers were far more likely to lose than incumbents if they were outraised. So these are trends that we see that, to the extent we care about democratic accountability, those sorts of things, how people get elected matters. But the other thing that we found was some support for the theory about the nationalization of certain elections. So we found people, we didn't identify them as candidates who ran on platforms of reform. We relied on lists that other people had put together of people who ran for local prosecutor, who some part of their platform was about combating mass incarceration or something along those lines. And we compared these candidates that other people had identified with candidates who were similar to them, right, in terms of whether the election was contested or uncontested, and also in terms of the population category. And with just 2 exceptions, we found that the reform candidates raised a lot more money than the other comparable candidates. And not only did they raise more money, but they tended to raise more money from outside of their district and also outside of their state. So we think that that is interesting and important. If you look at Kimberly Gardner, for example, who ran in St. Louis, Missouri, she got some incredibly large percentage of her donations from out-of-state probably because she's so close to Kansas, but still, a lot of these candidates are also getting media coverage that you just don't see for a lot of these other elections, and so people are starting to pay attention and starting to donate money to their campaigns. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about is some research that we did, not about prosecutors having to themselves stand for election or raise money, but what it looks like when prosecutors maybe wield their political power. That might be a little bit stronger than what my fellow panelists might call, but we looked at when prosecutors lobby. And the reason we studied this is there's like a conventional wisdom in the legal academy that prosecutors are very powerful political actors, very powerful political players in their own states. And that because they wield this political power, they're able to shape the legislative agenda of their state. And specifically, that they're able to get harsh legislation passed that gives them more power and block reform legislation, which would reduce their power. So we decided to test this theory. And we tested it by, we took a 4-year window from 2015 to 2017. We identified every single criminal justice related bill that we could find. And then after we identified it and logged it in a database, we then got information about who was lobbying in favor or against. This all came from public sources, so there are probably some gaps in what was happening behind closed doors. And also, some states actually don't do a great job of making information about who's lobbying in favor and against stuff particularly available. So we've only got good data on the lobbying from about 35 states. So what did we find? Well, in terms of national trends, we did find that across the country, it was true that prosecutors were more likely to support harsh bills, bills that would increase the scope of criminal law by like getting rid of defenses or creating new crimes, and more likely to oppose lenient bills, so like bills that might decrease punishments or establish new defenses or those sorts of things. And harsh bills also could also increase punishment. But the trend wasn't absolute by any stretch of the imagination. Prosecutors did oppose some harsh bills and support some lenient bills too. And we also found that they were more successful in supporting bills, so getting bills that they supported passed, than in getting bills that they opposed blocked, which that might not sound that interesting to you, but that's like the exact opposite of the political science literature when they look more broadly at lobbying. So another thing I'd be interested to hear about, like why less luck in opposing things? But I think the most interesting thing that we found was that prosecutors were most successful when they championed criminal justice reform. When they argued in favor of making the law less harsh, decreasing punishments, adding new defenses, the legislature was most likely to listen then. That's when they were most successful. Also less successful when it came to funding. You can't really see that here because you have to compare it to what was the ordinary pass rate. Not that good at like increasing their own budgets and those sorts of things. So when prosecutors played against type, that's when they seemed to be sort of most successful in their legislative agenda. So did we confirm the conventional wisdom? I don't think so. I mean, there's something to it. It's not totally divorced from reality, but it's a vast oversimplification, both of what prosecutors do and how much power they're able to wield in the state house. What did we find in Wisconsin? So in Wisconsin, we found that on average, the bills that we identified as related to the criminal justice system passed at a rate of 39%. So that means that when prosecutors supported bills, they got them passed at a higher rate, so 61%. When they opposed them, they passed at a lower rate, 17%. So they were pretty successful. Compared to other states, Wisconsin prosecutors were slightly worse than average in getting the bills that they supported passed. But they were pretty good. They were in the top third of getting the bills that they didn't want blocked. So some information there. Overall, we saw the pattern of supporting more punitive bills and opposing more lenient bills, but it certainly wasn't uniform. There was some support for some criminal justice reform legislation and some opposition to some bills that would have made the law harsher. During our study period, so the beginning of 2015 to the end of 2017, we found that the lobbying by prosecutors, again, the stuff we were able to see, not the stuff that happened behind closed doors, mostly focused on the reform of criminal procedure. So enhancing victims' rights, increasing defendants' post-conviction responsibilities, those sorts of things. Wisconsin was kind of unusual in that, especially when it came to written testimony, we found a lot more lobbying by the AG's office than we did from the state prosecutors associations. And that's different from what we've found in most other states. So in most other states, the statewide prosecutor associations are like the driving force behind the lobbying. They're the ones who are always standing up in front of the legislative committees and giving testimony either for or against bills. We were able to find, just from online sources, that Wisconsin has 2 different prosecutors associations, the Wisconsin District Attorneys Association and the Wisconsin Association of State Prosecutors. The latter seems to be more like a labor union, but the information for both of these organizations that's publicly available is really limited. We still classified them both as lobbying because in the state lobbying disclosures that groups are supposed to file, these groups had either one or both of the following: either registered lobbyists or reported expenditures that were sort of money spent in lobbying. So we felt comfortable classifying them as lobbyists, even though, as I said, so much of what we found involved the district attorney's office. I'd be fascinated to hear more about the political dynamics if our panelists want to share them. Let me just conclude by saying I'd be happy to talk about anything that people are interested in terms of the research that we're doing. Right now, we're finishing up some projects about media coverage that I alluded to before. We're also finishing up a project about marijuana enforcement in states where, like North Carolina, where it's still completely illegal, where there's no sort of medical marijuana exception or anything else like that. There's another project we'd love to do about trying to figure out views of prosecutors, sort of policy decisions that prosecutors make in their offices, and the extent to which they conform to or diverge from constituent views. But those sorts of surveys are really expensive, and we haven't found a funder for it yet. We want to do it, though, because there's a study from last year out of California where somebody used referendum data and actually found that there was, at least in some places, a pretty big split between the sort of the positions supported by elected prosecutors and then what their constituents voted for at the polls. But I promised 20 minutes. I believe I'm under 21 minutes, so I'll go ahead and stop there.
Pick your seat, John. Would you like to be in the middle?
Go
Then we
ahead.
can flank you and be super tall next to you.
No, please, after you.
Then I look short.
Bigger trip
You
up
wanna
on the
flank you
stool
if
for
you
me than
love
it
it.
was for you.
Okay, we'll now hear some reactions from our DA panelists. Does any one of you want to volunteer to go first?
All
We
right.
should do it in order. Oh, no, Christian. Okay, go ahead.
He asked. I've got a few thoughts, and I'll go backwards in order, I guess. On prosecutor lobbying, I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind in Wisconsin is we have 71 different district attorneys' offices. All but probably, 4 of those have less than 20 prosecutors. So probably every criminal justice bill that is presented has prosecutor input in some capacity, but it's a text message from your local representative, or it's a phone call, or you're sitting in a bar. So there is a lot of discussion that goes back and forth. And I think that in talking with Teresa, oftentimes, I just tell legislators how I think the bill will impact the criminal justice system. It's up to them if they want to pass it or not. We aren't adding anything to the criminal justice system anymore. We can take things out and replace them, but DA's offices are 20% understaffed when we're fully functional. So if they want to pass new laws, if they want to add new things, other things come out. So I think a lot of times prosecutors are just sort of acting as a reporter of this is what it'll look like. If you do this, you can do it, but here's the positives, here's the negatives, do what you want to do.
And if I could, I would just add, really the WDAA and Association of State Prosecutors, they serve really two primary functions in practical terms, asking for more people and asking for more money for their people. That's it. They do not have any influence over the legislature any more than the public defenders do. And why? There's a historical reason for it, and that is that in 1990, the state became sort of unified in how it funds their assistant DAs. Prior to that, everyone would have been an employee of the county that they served in. What people figured out at that time, and it was actually at the urging of the Dane County DAs and the Milwaukee County DAs at the time, they wanted to make it more uniform across the state because you were getting paid just bare minimum wage if you were in one of the smaller counties, and you were actually making a fairly decent salary in Milwaukee County. And so they wanted to professionalize the organization across the state by making it uniform. What they didn't anticipate in doing that is that they actually removed any political influence with the legislature, right? I mean, the legislature in Madison, ultimately, they don't really care about 72 independently elected DAs, all with different needs and desires and arguing over different things. They can kind of ignore them for the most part. So I would actually make the argument that the WDAA has traditionally been one of the weakest, and it's actually documented in the fact that if you looked at the recent Badger Institute report that studied the compensation for assistant DAs and public defenders in the state of Wisconsin, they are just outrageously lower than any other government attorney. For example, city attorneys are making $20,000, $30,000 more than assistant DAs, corporation counsel, assistant AGs, U.S. attorneys. It doesn't matter. They're all in the $30,000 to $40,000 more than an assistant DA is making. So that historically is one of the reasons that the WDAA has been relatively weak by comparison to maybe other state organizations.
And as a former member of the WDAA board, a very recent member of the WDAA board, I can attest to that we are not this powerful lobbying group, that a lot of our focus was, in fact, salaries and trying to get additional positions. Our starting prosecutors make $26.70 an hour. It's very hard to recruit prosecutors, and one of the things that I want to kind of getting out of order, I don't mean to take away from that here. You know, we have 3 elected prosecutors up here. We're all going to be fighting for time. So I'm taking mine. This is a really important office, and we are the top litigators, and to find people who want to run for this office is very, very difficult. First of all, there's a shortage of, I'm from Marathon County, which if you don't know where that is, it's Wausau, Wisconsin. About 135,000 people in our county. And we just recently had a judiciary election where we had a judicial election where we had to scramble to try to get candidates to run. We're having conversations with attorneys on elevators saying, how about you really run? Never actually thought of that person as a judge or wanting to be a judge, but we need a body in that spot. That's really where it's at. I've been part of the hiring process in Marathon County since 2006, and we used to have 60 to 70 candidates. Now we have 0. There are 37 open positions for prosecutors in the state right now. He's got a lot of numbers.
3 L's, make a note. 3 L's, make a note.
Yes. So you have to have somebody who has experience as a top litigator. You have to be a top litigator, especially in a small county where you are going to be litigating homicide cases. I have 12 attorneys on my staff. I have to be able to mentor them. They're all very inexperienced because they don't make a lot of money. So I have to be able to mentor them as trial lawyers, and I have to be able to run a law office of 13 attorneys, and all of the support staff is my responsibility as well. And you have to live in the county where you are elected. So to find individuals that far north who are willing to do that, if you talk to a criminal defense attorney, even that far north, they're making more money than a prosecutor is, an elected district attorney is. So they're not going to run and take a pay cut. You go ahead.
All right. So my numbers that I put together. So currently, as we sit today, 40 of 71 district attorneys in Wisconsin would get a pay raise if they step down from their position.
I'm one of them.
She is. I stepped down in May, and I got my $17,660 pay raise. 47 of 71 district attorneys in Wisconsin are in their first 2 terms in office. 62 of 71 are in their 3rd term or less. That's 87% of the prosecutors, and 9 DAs have stepped down this year alone, myself included. So I think part of the answer to the question, why don't people run against DAs? You don't need to, just wait. And for the people who are graduating, McKenna's already got 1 spot, but I've still got open spots in my office. Anybody at the front, you can start at $55,000 a year, $57,000 if you want to be a paralegal. Just forego getting your doctoral degree. So the numbers really kind of explain a little bit about what's going on here in Wisconsin.
And the impact, the practical impact in my office, for example, when I took over in 2007, roughly about 125 attorneys on staff. It stayed mostly the same over the last 16 years or so. But I have hired now 225 attorneys during that 16-year period. So if you were to make a healthcare analogy, do you really want to go in for surgery with a doctor right out of the Medical College of Wisconsin? Or would you prefer to have somebody that had 5 to 10 years experience doing the work, right? So that's what you're dealing with. And I know we should probably switch to the other, if we're going in reverse order, we can kind of get into the topic a little bit of raising money to have this wonderful job. and to
It is a
engage,
wonderful job.
Yeah, and to engage in and it is, it's the best job in the entire country. However, it has become increasingly more difficult in the political context, right? I'm happy to say that it looks like I will not be fired on January 3rd. But it makes me almost want to cry to think back. I've got Irene, who put on my first swearing-in ceremony back in 2007. And if you knew who spoke at my swearing-in ceremony in January of 2007, you'd say, that couldn't happen today. You couldn't have Tom Barrett and Scott Walker on the same DS together. You couldn't have Louis Butler and Mike Brennan on the same panel together. You could not have it. I mean, so maybe that was just absolutely naive optimism, but I don't think so. I just think things have changed. And one thing that has changed is that we have decided as a country that dark money can dominate politics right now. So my $200,000 that you saw up there, that was $200,000 that I had to raise from the people that were interested in the Milwaukee County DA's office. My opponent, who probably came in with like $40,000, she was on TV. She was on TV because the Club for Growth was involved in that race right there. So that's what you're dealing with now. It's not, it almost doesn't matter how much money you do or don't raise individually right now. You're looking at the races that we've just experienced. They've gotten outrageously expensive, and it's all coming from sources that you'll never be able to actually pinpoint and say, where is that coming from?
And just to be clear, our study, we didn't look at this dark money, these independent expenditures, and the reason we didn't look at them was because it was too difficult to get that information. So to the extent that you care about transparency when it comes to campaign finance issues, and Wisconsin's a lot better than a lot of other states. I was able to type in district attorney and just download all of the files. It's not the case when it comes to independent expenditures. We literally couldn't find that information in a lot of states.
Now,
so
here's the counterpoint to it, right? And that is that there is also a trend in major cities that I would call primary populism, right? And that means that for example, you find that large amounts of money can be directed to one candidate that may have a very specific ideological agenda, right? And as a consequence, you push people to the extremes, right? Because you have to win your primary. If you win your primary, the race is over. So whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you get pushed to the extreme. If you're going to run as a Republican in a Republican county, you better be the most conservative, backed by the strongest, most moneyed people. And to a certain extent, you can argue the same is occurring in some major cities with the progressive movement as well. And that's a danger, in my view. Both of them are dangerous. That's why some states, like you're seeing what Alaska is doing to address this, Minnesota does it to a certain extent with ranked choice. It's a way of getting away from that, getting people away from just identifying on the extremes and not reaching across the full spectrum, so that you can have that ideal group of people at your swearing-in ceremony that are basically saying, yeah, we just want somebody that's going to run a clean office, do it on principle, make sure that they do their job the best they possibly can with the best people they possibly can.
It seems to me like maybe we're getting a little bit of an illustration of one of the points that Carissa was making, which is that things look really different if you're looking at big jurisdiction counties. The whole political situation is really dramatically different in the small number of high population urban districts in comparison with others. I mean, Teresa, are you seeing dark money in Marathon County?
No. So what's interesting, I was just thinking while the DA was talking, is that at my last election, one of my very young assistant district attorneys was approached to run against me by the opposing political party. And they offered to put whatever money he needed to run against me up for it. It wasn't dark money, but it was something that he came to me with, and he said, "You're who should be in this office. I could not do what you're doing right now because I don't have the experience, I don't have the trial experience, I don't have the life experience to do that job right now," and came to me and told me about it and said, "I'm not going to do it, I just want to let you know." And they did not, the person who was trying to put money up did not care whether that person was experienced, whether that person would be a top prosecutor, whether that person would be able to run the office and be the best person for our county in that position. They were willing to put that money up because that person affiliated with that political party. So on a very smaller scale, that's what we experienced in our county. So.
And I think that there's the small county versus large county. Winnebago County is 170,000 people. As Teresa was saying before, you're a working prosecutor. It doesn't matter what the label is. When I stepped down as a Republican district attorney, and my deputy district attorney was appointed as the Democrat district attorney. The office runs the same. Right. It doesn't make a difference. Partisanship really gets blown out of proportion in DA's races. Everybody wants to make their community safer, and we're all trying to figure out how. Now, the problem is that you've got 5 fire hoses running on you at any given point in time, and then somebody says, "Hey, why don't you light a couple matches for me?" Well, I'd love to, but I'm a little bit overwhelmed here. My new district attorney is doing a week-long homicide trial right now. We're an office of 12 attorneys. When we're fully staffed, we haven't been able to fill positions. We've lost 4 attorneys since May. By the way, the average increase in pay for all 4 of them was $21,000 a year to walk out the door. 3 of them will be doing municipal prosecutions, where they'll be handling things like parking tickets and urinating in public, as opposed to homicides and sexual assaults. They probably won't get nearly as many death threats, though, so they're going to lose out on that. There's a lot happening in a DA's office, a smaller DA's office, where the politics just doesn't matter. It's all hands on deck. Everybody try to keep our community safe. And probably the most basic analysis for prosecutors is about a 1 to 10,000 ratio is ideal by one metric for population. That would give us 17 prosecutors. We have 12 when we're fully staffed, 10 right now. We're going to be able to, we're down to 8. We're bringing in 2, which means we'll have 2 training. You do the math, and pretty soon, who cares what your politics are? We have victims of crime. We have bad things happening. Let's do what we can and scramble and keep it safe. And the only reason you should ever leave is if you want to get paid more than a paralegal.
I know that Carissa's also done some other research, and I personally am just really excited that we are now having academic focus and discipline on the role of the prosecutor in the democratic process. I had an opportunity to spend some time with Michael Tonry from University of Minnesota Law School, who had done some of the seminal work. There was always Joan Jacoby, for example, and I think recently, I can't remember, is it Michael Ellis or there's some other work. But you'd be amazed that the bibliography on the history of the elected DA in the United States is really short. There just hasn't been a lot of examination of what it is. But fundamentally, what you can say is it is exceptional. It is exceptional. The American people have decided that they want an elected, accountable person making decisions based on the most important right that you have as an American, and that's your liberty, pure and simple. And they want that local accountability, and how they achieve that is through this electoral process. The difference between the large and small, yeah, it's a matter of scale sometimes. I often reflect my first jury trial in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, as a intern in the UW Law School. After the first day of trial, since I only had 2 suits, and this trial was going to go a couple days, I sent my wife. I didn't send her; she volunteered. She goes into the local men's clothing store and asks if she can look at some suit coats, and the guy says 44 extra long. And she said, "How do you know?" He said, "I'm sitting on the jury." I've still got that suit coat.
That's a good start.
But I mean, that's the difference, right? I mean, that can be both good and bad in terms of accountability, right? I mean, the pressures on Teresa and Christian are very much more visceral, right? I mean, I had the elected DA sitting next to me and saying, "Yeah, I know this guy. He smokes a little bit of pot, but he's a decent guy." And literally knowing everybody on the jury panel. We don't encounter that as often. But one of our commitments has been through our community prosecution efforts, community partnership efforts is how we now rebrand them, is to have that footprint, that place in the community so that we are responsive to the needs of the community. So that's an accountability challenge. But again, I would argue that it should be examined and it should be valued highly as well, so that when authoritarian candidates arise, which is the challenge to the country at this moment, and you can say it's the challenge in the past as well. When authoritarian candidates come up and say that they think they know better than the people of Milwaukee County about who their elected representative ought to be, and that they're going to take some kind of illegal action, there should be a visceral response to that. It would be my argument, is you should have a very strong response to anybody that wants to take away your right to control the people that make the most important decisions in your community.
I was going to bring up about the 23% of criminal justice bills that district attorneys were weighing in on or lobbying. Is that right? Is that the right data?
Yeah.
So I would venture to guess that those are the bills that were brought to the attention of the district attorneys. Most often, I am talking with my legislators because they come to me with a bill and they say, "Hey, we want to know, will this have the practical implications that we think it will, or is it going to do some harm to the criminal justice system?" And oftentimes, I'll sit down and say, "Okay, this is how this will work if it's applied, and this is the current law as applied," and then they will take that back and determine whether or not it promotes whatever it is that they want to promote. So they're bringing those to us rather than us going out and seeking to give input on any of these bills or laws. And I think the percentage is quite low because we do not have a very active lobbying group on our behalf. And I think that is a good role for a district attorney to talk to a legislator who has no idea what the practical implications will be in their jurisdiction if that law is passed. So, and a lot of times laws are passed with unintended consequences, such as resources to enable us to actually enforce those laws or enact what they're trying to accomplish by those laws. So we can educate the legislators about that because we're in the field. So I just want to point out that I think that's a large part of why we get involved in any of the bills that we get involved in is because we're asked to, because we are the experts in our field. We are the ones who have the information.
And I think we probably do tend to, as a group, oppose procedural bills, but not because we're opposed to, trying to enhance rights, things of that sort. We've already got 400 hours each day accounted for, and if we could only spend an extra 10 minutes on every case to do this, it sounds good, but it's not practical. And so a lot of the procedural bills, but I think that those are the conversations I have too, is what are the collateral consequences? What is it that's going to, what are we not seeing that you're aware of in the office? And those are the conversations we have.
Or even the wording may need to be changed because we can see there's ambiguity in the way it's written. So we give some input on that. They take that back, and then it doesn't end up going anywhere. So those are just some of the ways.
I'd also add, partisanship aside, I talked to Democrats and Republicans, and even at the legislative or legislative level, I think all of them are trying to do good things. They clearly disagree on how to do them, but both parties will reach out to district attorneys of either party and say, what do you think?
Yeah, Christian and I have both participated in, for example, the fair and just prosecution programs, which have assisted us in helping analyze the work we do and going public with that. I think, again, that's, you see entities like Measures for Justice, you see attempts to make the criminal justice system more transparent. Because as Carissa indicated, again, I mean, there's even setting aside the criminal prosecution units, if you add in the municipal prosecution, you've got 3,000, 4,000 different entities involved in administering justice around the country. And each one of them is a little bit nuanced. Each one of them is a little bit different. Each one of them has its own local flavor, you might want to argue. And so it can become really, really difficult to try to put your arms around it and synthesize it and say, this is the way justice is done in the United States. I still think that we have some strengths in the state of Wisconsin that we should take more advantage of. And one is, it is, believe it or not, the CCAP system, which can be abused, and it could be a negative thing, but it also would allow you to do things like I know that Christian has done, for example, is do deep dives on his own data and his surrounding county data and find out if there's anomalies there that concern him. I'll give you an example of one that concerned Christian. He saw that they were issuing an extraordinarily high number of prostitution cases out of his county. And when he dove into that, he found out that all the defendants were black women from Milwaukee. And why was that? Well, because they had a task force, a law enforcement-centered task force up there that was doing sting operations and basically contacting women from Milwaukee, bringing them up to hotels in the local area for a liaison, and then arresting them for prostitution, right? So you were bringing the problem to the community, whereas our approach here in Milwaukee would be, why don't you connect those individuals, many of whom are being sexually exploited and trafficked, why don't you connect them with the Benedict Center, which is exactly what Christian wanted to do. So that wasn't a Democrat or a Republican thing. He called me, we shared data, we brought together interested parties. We brought the U.S. Attorney's Office in to look at the issue and say, is this really a good idea, a good way of using law enforcement resources? So there are things that you can do in the state of Wisconsin. You do have a unified public defender system here, which is a huge asset and should be used. You have a unified court system. The brand of justice you get in Milwaukee County should not be significantly different than what you get in Marathon County. It just shouldn't be. It is, but it shouldn't be.
And it's a learning and evolving system. And out of that same incident with the prostitution cases, Winnebago County subsequently worked with the partners that John had talked about, as well as the Attorney General's office, and we put together a victim-centered model approach that the Attorney General's office has published now as a model way to deal with those types of cases. So it's a growing and evolving system.
I have a question I'd like to pose to the panel. Imagine that you have a friend or a family member, lives in a different state, contacts you, says, hey, we've got a contested DA election in my county. How do I know who to vote for? What are the criteria that I should use as a voter to make a good decision about this race? And what are the criteria, and how do I get the information that I would need to get to make a good evaluation of how the incumbent's doing? What do you think about that?
How big is the jurisdiction?
That was my question.
How big is the jurisdiction? Because it
Let's say it's the
matters.
same size as Marathon County.
Okay, so then it's going to be a working prosecutor. So by that I mean somebody who is going to be trying cases, going to be responsible for the highest profile cases, murder cases, high sexual assaults, kidnappings, armed robberies. So they need to know how to be able to try a case. So that's something that I think is a necessary qualification, is that they're a top litigator. Beyond that, I think other things that they've been involved in, have they been involved in the community? Are they in touch with the community as far as what is going on in the community organizations? Are they out there in the public? Because I do think in a small community is very essential, and in a large community as well, but especially in a small community, that you're in touch with your constituents, that you're out amongst the people, that you're involved, that you're in touch with what it is that they're concerned about, what it is that is troubling them or they think is working well. You go ahead.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think you can, if it's a small community like ours, you just show up at a meet and greet and ask the questions you want to ask, and see if they're in line with what you want to hear. The thing I don't like about elections is rhetoric. So I think it's harder when you get to the larger municipalities where you're relying on, radio and TV and things of that sort. 30-second sound bites. If you want to get to know the prosecutor candidates in a smaller county, go ask them. They're all going to have meet and greets, and just ask them pointed questions. But I agree with Teresa. First and foremost, there was a study done in '94 that, 94 that found that the average experience level of a prosecutor in Wisconsin was 6 years. Back in 2010, we looked at it, and Wisconsin turned over an average, or 100% of the ADAs every 5.5 years. So if you're going to be an elected district attorney, you're going to have a young staff, and your staff is going to turn over. The 4 attorneys that will have left our office this year all had less than 3 years experience. Sorry, one had 7, the others had less than 3 years experience. It's a constant training cycle. So you've got to be able to do everything, handle everything. But how we evaluate our prosecutors when we hire them, pro tip for anybody who wants to be a prosecutor, it's about humility. We want people who are going to be reasonable, who are going to be fair and honest. When I was reading through the research, I saw the power of the prosecutor. I tell my people, if you think prosecutors have power, go work somewhere else. You have responsibilities and you have duties, and that's it. And first breath, that comes out, it has anything to do with a power trip, you're out of here. You won't make it. We need people who are, you're part of the community that you're prosecuting, and you have to solve the underlying issues.
And you have to be able to make decisions at the moment, and you have to be able to make quality decisions without much information often.
When you're driving in the snow.
When you're driving in the snow. On the way down here, I had...
Illegally texting back.
No, I did not say that. I did not say that. Why did I sit next to him? So you have to, in the middle of the night, prosecutor's office is on call 24/7 for law enforcement. If there's a search warrant, you're making decisions about whether or not there's probable cause to go in. You're reviewing those search warrants. You're answering questions in the middle of the night. You're answering questions that are going to turn an investigation. They don't have time to wait. They don't have time for you to sit there and look in your statute book and try to figure out an answer. You need to know your stuff. And you need to be sure about it because you don't want something to come back on appeal that you made the wrong decision or violate somebody's rights. Or not do right by a victim. So you have to have a confident, experienced litigator, prosecutor in that position, in my opinion.
Who can also self-market. It's very weird.
Yes.
John, what do you think about criteria for evaluating prosecutors? And I guess maybe we should get a view about a prosecutor in a bigger county. Let's say our hypothetical relative lives in Los Angeles, for instance.
Yeah, sure. And that's one area where you can actually go increasingly now and get some data, right? You can go to different sites that have evaluated them, but you have to be careful about those as well. And I'll give you an example. As part of a process of being transparent with our community, we've published a number of data sets on how we try to process problems in our community and address, both in terms of racial disparity and how quickly we process, how quickly we contact victims, all these different measures that we do. But some of them can be deceptive, right? So we might look really good in one category, and then say Cook County might look really bad on another thing on disparity. And then you find out, for example, something as unexpected as this would be that in Cook County, for example, police officers issue all of their felony drug cases. They don't bring them to the DA. The police officers get to directly file a felony charge against a person for a drug-related case. Now you can imagine that might just possibly lead to a high level of cases that get later sifted through the system because they didn't meet the threshold that we would hold ourselves to would be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's just one example. So when you're looking at the data, you just have to be careful. But it's, at the end of the day, it really comes down to the same thing, and that is the person running, are they the same criteria you use to hire an assistant DA? Are you a good person? Do you want to do justice? Do you want to do the right thing? That's been the criteria in the Milwaukee County DA's office from day one, is do justice to the best of your ability. It's complicated, but not that complicated sometimes. So what you're looking for is that. I would make this distinction, and that is that that even though I'm apparently a non-working DA, I will. I was once a working DA, but that's the distinction right there, right? Is that I often say I drew the short straw back in 2006 to try to replace E. Michael McCann in this position, because I wanted to continue the tradition of people who came into the office being given the mission to do the right thing, to do justice to the best of their ability. So that's one of the reasons that you run, and the point being that currently I'd say in major cities there's kind of the political run. There's a political DA that runs essentially on ideological points, but there still are a number of them who are like working DAs from that office. And the distinction that I would make is that I'm often very careful about the approaches I take, because I know that I have to preserve the people in their positions to serve the community. So it's not just about my ideology, it's not just about what I want, it's about how do we preserve in a very hostile environment sometimes the people that want to do this work. How do we support them? How do I protect them while they're making those tough decisions? What do you do when those decisions maybe go sideways and something happens that nobody could have predicted and nobody would have ever wanted, but it goes bad? What do? Do you bury it? Do you hide it? Do you run from it? Or do you acknowledge that you played some role in it and that you're committed to improving it in the future? That's sort of the transparent and honest approach to it that I think is, in this political environment, increasingly difficult for people to do, even if they want to. They're afraid. They're afraid that if they do the right thing, they are going to have tremendous pressures put on them, and maybe even have somebody run against them and remove them from that position for purely ideological reasons. So,
God willing.
That's the challenge in the environment. So I'd say in the bigger cities, what you should really just be looking for is somebody that's motivated to be a caretaker for their community.
Could I our time is almost up. I want to make sure Carissa gets a final opportunity
Yeah.
to respond to
So I guess
anything.
I'll just really quickly, just so that we're clear, because I don't think I made this quite clear when I was at the podium, across the nation, prosecutors did not do well when they went for funding. Like that's not, I think Wisconsin's not uniquely sort of disadvantaged there. I think every place they were like, yeah, you want more money, never mind. But the last piece of this discussion I just found so fascinating because I think what D.A. Chisholm alluded to when he said, look, you can't ask the same questions about what happens here as opposed to what's happening in Cook County, Illinois, because the law is different. It's not just the law that makes it so difficult to draw comparisons. We find this all the time. It's, there are particular practices or particular customs in a courthouse. I was talking to the elected DA in Buffalo, New York, and he's like, yeah, we don't charge our cases, the police do. And I was like, why are you doing that? Like the Manhattan DA charges his cases. And he's like, so? Okay, good to know. I wouldn't have known that they didn't charge their own cases if I hadn't had a phone call with this guy who was nice enough to talk to me. But the challenge then becomes, if things are so different, not just from state to state, but office to office, when somebody asks you what makes for a good DA, the answers are necessarily somewhat general. They should have experience. They shouldn't be like a raging power maniac. They should be seeking justice. Hopefully all of the people who are running for the office check all of those boxes. And I think the problem is really that it's just so unclear to the rest of us what happens that it's hard for us to even know which questions to ask, let alone how to compare the answers. So thank you all very much. I feel like I know a lot more
Okay.
about Wisconsin.
Well, that's all the time we have for. Please join me in thanking our panelists.